Well, welcome back to the second half of Carrah Quigley's. I feel so weird saying podcast or interview. To me, it's just it's conversation with you because I'm always learning from you. And this story is fascinating because your story of your father and the crime he committed and learning about it at age 19. I shouldn't say the word is inspiring, but it's inspiring as to how you processed it and how you allowed something that could have just destroyed you.
It did.
And you rebuilt. Mm-hmm. You had to fly a new foundation. So let's kind of begin to where you're now. You can kind of take me through your 20s and 30s of where you started to, I don't know if it's rebuild. Would you say rebuild? Or what would you say?
You know, looking back on that decade of my 20s, I think I had a typical 20-year-old white girl, American, insecurity, flip out, cry all the time, 20s. Uh-huh. I think that they're full of anger, full of insecurity, full of I'm fat in all the wrong places and everybody else is skinny. I mean, this is the 20s, right?
Yeah.
I want a boyfriend. I want a boyfriend. No, I don't want a boyfriend. I love being single. No, I want a boyfriend. You know, this happens. I'm also in New York City, which I love, and I'm in acting school. I've got this wealth of emotion inside of me, and I can't use any of it because it's too big, it's too much, it's too monumental. Nobody would be able to relate to it, and certainly nobody that's ever been written in scripts that we're acting for has this to relate to. And they always say never use your biggest thing. So I felt like in acting school I had all of this stuff inside of me that couldn't be used. And so I never, in that discipline of acting, I achieved what I wanted to in terms of discipline, learning the craft and loving it. And the school part of it was amazing. But performance for me, I could hit it every once in a while. Uh-huh. But the gravity of what was going on inside of me often would create a flat affect, which is really strange in acting to have a flat affect.
Well, and it's strange for me to know that because you are somebody who... You're emotive. Ugh. You speak very clearly. Like I don't. There's not an Asperger's bone in your body in terms of like this is the emotion and this is the proper facial expression. Yeah. Like I know where I'm coming. I know where I'm coming from, or you're coming from when we connect.
Right.
But I do understand that you would hit that emotional wall plateau to where it's like I can't go there. Was there ever a time where you were in a scene or whatever and like that tickle came in your brain of like, maybe I'll go there, or was it always just, it was buried?
Because you remember over a period of 10 years, I told 3 people.
And did any of how was their reaction? Did any of them really disappoint you with their reaction?
It's always mixed. It's depending on their proximity to me, okay? They'll get very emotional. I mean, people have broken down because they know my dad. Oh. And they can't, my best friend to this day, I still can't talk to her about it because she can't cope with the beauty of my father and it being so ripped up, you know, or that the beauty is because of that is even harder to cope with.
Yes.
You know, that the extraordinariness of my father came at a price.
Yes.
What the currency you're seeing and that is being earned right now is because there's a huge debt back there that can't ever be repaid. So in that, I think for some people who learned, it was very difficult to rectify those two things. Even my uncle said, I can't rectify. It's like that other thing never happened.
Oh God, I know the feeling. It's like when I see like, you know, you get proposed to with a beautiful diamond or you have those beautiful mala beads that, you know, some child, you know, died for. At the end of the day, the blood money for the feeling of the positivity, it's so conflicting. I can't even imagine what it would be like. And then for you to kind of do this dance of like, how you can't even really be there for the other person because you're still
at that time. So the other reaction I get, which is very common, is that I'm irrational.
That you're irrational.
Oh, yeah.
This is a surprising one for me.
Even a therapist said that to me once. And she was trying to be helpful. I mean, she was good in all sorts of things. But when I explain to people the feeling I have of my responsibility to stop school shootings, or my responsibility for our country to change society, or to help boys, or to help redo the education system, when I say things or when I tell the story, very often this reaction is, that's got nothing to do with you. That's your dad. It's not you. You're irrational. Why are you taking it on? I'm like, well, because I share his DNA, but that's not you. I'm like, do you see what's happening in America? That's not you. I'm like, how can anyone be given this information and then sit in this culture and just be like, it's got nothing to do with me?
I mean,
I can't do that.
No.
It has everything to do with me.
Well, one of my next questions, and not to get too far ahead because I'm jumping timeline, is when you found out you're pregnant with your daughter, was there a moment in your head where you were like, oh my gosh,
one
this
day
is
I
in
will
me?
have to tell her.
Well, and also bloodline, like
Yeah.
maybe it's in the blood, like a concern for her mental health.
No, I didn't, because I knew it was the bullying.
And that's, to me, that is, I think, such a key piece to share with people.
Mm-hmm. Now, the instability, the anxiety that comes with being a sensitive boy, yeah, I can see where I thought maybe, you know, or when I ended up mentally ill, why did my parents tell me, oh, here's free money for a counselor, because they understood the history, right?
Yeah.
Didn't happen. Yeah. But no, with my daughter, it was just, for me, it was more like I'm going to have to tell her one day.
Have you told her yet?
She found out.
She found out.
She found out at 10. My mother had a slip.
Yeah.
And talked about the documentary that we had made. And so, of course, my daughter, being her iPad self, Googled everything and found out.
Wow. How did you, even at 10 years old,
I just said, your pop did something really, really, really bad a long time ago.
Yeah.
And she said, I know. And she said, it doesn't bother me. And I said, okay, well, if you have any questions, you can let me know anytime. And of course, I'm bawling because I had always thought, and I'm dramatic, so I had always thought at some point when she gets to be 16, 17, I was going to have a camping trip with her and take her to the top of some peak and be like, hey, let me tell you something about your pop, But
I guess you still can.
It's
I think that in some ways, it's so interesting when you find out something at a young age where your brain can't really process the gravity of it. And then having it be something that is now known and then revisiting it at a time to where, I don't know.
Where it means more.
Where it means more. Like I can't help but kind of go back to discussing with my father, his illness and his past. And he told these stories so many times before to me, and I'd laughed them off, stories about cruelty or being teased or his body failing him. And the brothers overpowering each other and him talking about weakness in the body and now it means something so different. And I think it's so important that I've been proposed to twice, and people are like, oh, well, you've already been, how did it feel with your husband? I'm like it was the first time. So I don't know. I mean, the way you describe your daughter and that when I've met her, she just seems I don't know. I'm sure you will take her to a mountaintop and revisit it. So.
She's kind of over it.
She's probably over it.
Yeah, she doesn't. It doesn't. Yeah. It might mean more to her in the future, certainly, and it could be also that she takes on what I've taken on since my dad's death, which is that, I think much more now about how do you build your life after sitting in a prison cell.
Yeah.
And what inside of you has to happen where you could actually be okay with the rest of your life. Having committed that crime, how do you take a step forward and make peace with that so that you can live the rest of your life? I mean, this is something I can't even comprehend. Or when I'm having a bad day, I'm like, well, you're not in a prison cell, dude.
Yeah. Now here's my question. Because your father brought you up and you were brought up in a Christian household. What shifted? Because I do believe that there's so much shame associated with committing a crime, and especially that of murder, in some ways I would think you would have to find a way, a few steps away from religion, to start to think about things a little bit more on the philosophical or intellectual side to cope with moving forward. Not only as, your father moving forward, but as someone who is processing it. Did something change?
No, I think my father at the time certainly was fully embedded in Christian theology. And in Christian theology, you are redeemed by the blood of Christ. And so I think for him, the figure of Jesus Christ truly was the redemption. And so for him, it was to be Christ-like. And so when we were involved in helping the refugees, he kept saying to me, this is Christianity. Risking your job, risking your life for those that need you. He was very adamant about that. So we were social justice Christians. But theologically, my father was far more traditional than I was. I mean, I don't know about the end of his life, but certainly from the time period up until his 50s, he believed that he was going to meet Jesus Christ at the end of his life.
What made you step away from that?
I read too much. I went into seminary. I went into seminary because I thought that if my father had killed somebody, I could become a minister and make up for that death by helping people. That if I could somehow head a church, which, funny enough, I never wanted to head a church. I just wanted to preach.
Yeah.
I want to talk. That somehow if I could do God's work, then God could see that and it would make up for my dad's crime. And what I did not know at the time, as I was trying to double down on Christianity, was that I was experiencing second generation trauma. So my biology had inherited from my father the guilt and shame. And so I was trying my best to react from that guilt and shame to do the stuff that I thought God would approve of. I would be approved of if I did this work, and it would make up for the life that was taken. And you talk about what did I do in my 20s, I tried to steer myself to make up for that life that was taken. And it took me until my 30s to realize that was not my job. Because true to what that second reaction always is, it's got nothing to do with me. I had to learn that in my own way. So the funny thing about that reaction when I tell people is I would always think about the freedom of that answer. It's got nothing to do with you. Imagine living that life without that information. How free would you be? So, Seraphine, this is what I did. I wavered back and forth trying to find the right way to live without the guilt and shame, sometimes with all the guilt and shame because I thought I was supposed to have it, until I learned what it meant to be authentic. And part of trauma is that you've got to go through those initial years of it totally absorbing you. And then the awareness of trauma too, because often trauma that happens in childhood, it's already happened. It's the awareness of it that causes that bigger trauma that you drown in. But you have to, again, it's the day by day. We're talking, you just live your life day by day, and eventually the things that fade away will fade away. The things that stay there are the things you have to work on. And ultimately, those are the things that set you free. So that the thing that I had to work on was living in this society as school shootings kept happening. And I knew some secrets here because I knew a school shooter. If I go public, which is terribly frightening, I will be set free because I'll be doing work. Action, action, action. I think finally as I opened my mouth, I was able to have a little bit more peace.
Where in your career, when you left New York, had you already finished, was it acting school that finished, or did you have a career in New York? What brought you back here?
Okay.
Or not back here. You were actually...
I was in acting school in New York until 1998. Had another, sort of mental episode, which I didn't know what they were linked to at the time. It turned out I had my own PTSD from things in childhood.
How did that show up for you?
Just being unable to live. I mean, unable to cope, unable to, anything extreme, from an extreme anxiety attack of having to hide in your bed and not be able to literally sensorily communicate with things, to the point of having auditory hallucinations, like where there's crunching in your mind and there's scraping and there's all sorts of horrible things happening. A total overwhelm, all your senses, incapacitated and paralyzed from all of that, from total overwhelmness, bawling my head off all the time, and then not knowing at the time, but leaving New York, realizing that I could do something else or try. Yeah. My attempt was to get to LA as an actor. But what I understood now, as I understand my PTSD, is that when things get so overwhelming, I want to leave the situation.
Yes, a flight.
Right. And as I drove away from Manhattan and the Twin Towers were looking at me, I thought, there it is. And I'm going to come back.
Yeah.
I never saw those towers again.
That's so crazy. So where were you headed to?
So I got to Tucson. I was going to recoup and then move to LA. And then while I was there, I was like, well, I'll just finish my degree. I was a creative writing major. I come back in. I think I'm going to get my degree in acting, even though I have a degree in acting. I think I'm going to get another one. And the acting coach said, you already know what happens to George and Martha in the third act. And I said, yes, I do. And I knew what he was quizzing me. He was asking me a question about Virginia Woolf. Yeah. And because I knew the answer, he's like, you don't need an acting degree. I mean, do you know the answer to the question? What's happening to George and Martha in the third act? I mean, it was a perfect test for me to know that he was talking about Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, to know that he was talking about their love and how dysfunctional and alcoholic it is. And that's when he just said, don't do this. So I was in some stupid class for St. Paul, on the epistles of St. Paul, and I got an A without studying on a test. And I was like, how is this, excuse me, I'm a stoner. Like, you don't get an A without studying your ass off. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I got an A. And I'm like, well, who is St. Paul and why is he important? I better perk up for this guy if I'm getting an A.
Yeah.
I got another A. And I'm like, what's going on? And so I was like, I'll just become a religion major. And I got straight A's for the first time.
What was it about religion?
I just got it. I got it. Me and Islam, woo!
Did you just
hand in glove?
Did you just dive into it at that time? Do you think the motivation was because, again, I mean, you had this father who redeemed himself in a saint-like manner. Mm-hmm. So was acquiring all the religion's knowledge, like reading,
I wanted to know everything.
A way, and by knowing it, how did it change you?
I felt better in the world. I felt like I understood more. If I have autism, it's this knack for chronology. I've got to know the chronology. Have to know. If I don't know the chronology, I will literally go insane. I don't know the steps that led to this thing. Yeah. How do I get there? So religion gave me chronology, which I was able to piece together so much of history. And I was able to see the world in a totally different way. I was able to understand, 2 centuries of art in a totally different way. Mm-hmm. I was able to understand color and symbolism and where things came from to get to where they are. I was able to understand patriarchy and sexism, certainly in a way that I couldn't before, and how much more profound and global it is. I was able to think in different ways, in layers and spectrums, instead of black and white. And then, of course, after graduating, I went to seminary, it's funny, it was one of the biggest mistakes, and yet I learned so much.
Tell me why seminary school was not the best decision.
I did not understand my own intellectual limits. So let me explain that. When I learn information, especially if it's new information and it's deep information and it's something I'm fascinated by, my brain goes in 30 different directions and wants to know everything all the time. Got to read every word. And when you're in graduate school, you really want to learn how to skim. Uh-huh. I'm not a skimmer.
No, you're not.
And so all this information was coming into my head, and I'm learning for the first time words like white privilege. Mm-hmm. I'm learning about the genocide in Belgium by King Leopold. Mm-hmm. I'm learning about the struggle of African Americans currently in the United States, but this is back 2002. Mm-hmm. I'm learning about living so close to Harlem now that I'm across from Columbia Union Theological Seminary, and I start to see what everybody starts to talk about. The cabs don't go above 125th Street.
Yeah.
And I start to learn, like, oh my God, there's racism. Mm-hmm. And I get to Harlem where I worked, and there's all these cars honking at me. I'm like, why are you honking at me? Yeah. Stop it. And it turns out those are the cabs in Harlem. So they see a white girl walking in Harlem. They're like, she definitely needs a ride. Yeah, she doesn't belong here. Because they'd call me Snowflake. Yeah. I would walk down the street, sup, Snowflake. And I thought it was because I was blonde. I had no idea it's because I was white. I was that dumb. Yeah. But there's a whole different cab service up there. And then when it would snow, I would notice, hey, nothing gets plowed above 125th Street. And I'm looking down at Manhattan and everything's been plowed down there.
Yeah.
There's no plows up here in Harlem. And you start to see the network. All the guys, the volunteer guys, get out and they start plowing themselves. And I'm like, wait a second. So all these people that are experiencing racism, obviously, government, done, they're all taking it up upon themselves to do it. It's really fascinating, the different economy that happens because of that. Different banks above 125th Street, because nobody's going to lend to black people below 125th Street. So it's up. And I'm starting to see all this stuff now. And I'm like, oh God, there is systemic racism. Like, because I hadn't seen it.
Yeah.
Right? Well, in Arizona, there's not a large black population in Arizona.
No.
So I never got exposed to the culture, really, right? But in seminary, it was totally different. This is, this is the seminary that churned out black theology, womanist theology, which is black feminist theology, turned out gay theology. I mean, this seminary turned out every single systematic theology in the 20th century, pretty much. And I start reading all these books, and my professor, Dr. James Cone, amazing professor, couldn't believe I was sitting in his presence. He's pretty much second to Cornel West. And Cornel West used to teach at Union. And I started learning. And from Dolores Williams, learning. And from Emily Towns, learning. These are all famous black scholars. And I mean, my head exploded.
Yeah.
I ended up in Columbia University Psychiatric Services. And I was screaming at the lady, and I still don't disagree with what I said. I said to her, you fucking realize we're going to get up and do it all again. And we're going to keep getting up and doing it all over again. And that motherfucker on the street is going to get up and do it all over again. And we're going to keep doing it and nothing's going to change. How the fuck is this supposed to happen?
Yeah.
And she's like, ma'am, I think we have some medication we can give you. And I think that we need to calm you down.
Oh.
And I didn't want to be calmed down.
I
was suffering from a case of newly found racial injustice.
Oh.
And my head, and so here's the thing. I used to struggle before my child with major suicidal ideation. So as I'm sitting and waiting to get into this waiting room at Columbia Psychiatric Services, I'm literally clawing the seat because I'm going to fucking jump out the window. And I could see myself jumping out the window, and I could see myself getting cut by shards of glass, and I could see the rain of blood on the sidewalk as I was coming down and hitting. I could hear my head splitting open. I could hear my brain slushing out. This is suicidal ideation, falling in love with this mystic experience of your own death. And I was literally clawing the chair until she called my name to come in. And I was screaming at her in this room. And I wasn't wrong. I just have to say, I might not have been mentally unstable. I definitely was mentally unstable. But the thing is, a lot of psychiatric services are trying to get you back in your package and shut you up so you go and continue to churn the treadmill again. And that bothered me, that nothing was going to change, that we're going to still get up and do it all over again. We're still going to get up, take a shit, brush our teeth, take our coffee, and go do it again. And nothing about the horrible systems that we've created are ever going to stop or change. And so my psychiatric breakdown happened because I needed things to stop.
Yeah.
And it was because I was learning too much at such a fast rate. And my level of learning is way the fuck up there. It's not enough for me to pass the test. I've got to be able to know beyond the test. I didn't know that about myself.
Did any of the professors, did any of them, did they see
They understood
this?
exactly what was happening to me.
So if that being said, when you went and had the psychological break, was it immediately take her out of this? She needs to go get help. She doesn't need to be back subjected to the teachings.
So the woman that came to get me from psychiatric services, she was the administrator for admissions, Sue Pak, and she's a pretty famous theologian in her own right. And she walked me back from psychiatric services. They gave me a Zyprexa, which is what they call the sledgehammer. Don't I want a sledgehammer all the time? Anyway, and she walked me back and she sat me in her office and she said, I don't think you know me, but I'm North Korean. And I said, okay.
Yeah.
And she said, do you know what I do when something goes wrong? I pack my bags. And do you want to know why I pack my bags? Because when I was a kid, there was a siren that went off. And my parents had to pack their bags and run for the border in 10 minutes. Or else the border was going to close and they weren't going to make it to South Korea. And she said, so what I suffer from is called second generation trauma. She said, I know you, and I know your story. I'm going to tell you something you haven't told yourself. You didn't kill anybody. And I was like, oh. And that was the first time I'd ever heard that. And of course I sobbed. And then she said, you are far too hard on yourself. Learn to read the first sentence and the last sentence of a paragraph.
Yes.
And call it a day.
Yeah.
And she's like, you don't have to know everything. And I'm like, but I hunger, I thirst. And there was a footnote in Dolores Williams' book, Sisters of the Wilderness, that said, Rosa Parks sat down so that Martin Luther King could stand up.
I love.
And I thought, if I'd missed that footnote, I wouldn't have that.
Yeah,
That's a really fucking good footnote.
It is. It's a great footnote.
But again, she's telling me, she's like, you're overstudying, you're overdoing everything. And then finally, when she said that to me, that I didn't kill anybody, I knew I didn't have to be at seminary anymore.
And how old were you when this happened?
I was 27.
Jesus, I can't even imagine at 27. I mean, I was wearing low-rise jeans and pink hats and thinking I was an overage Britney Spears trying to navigate Laguna Beach. It blows my life, my mind and my life out the water, where I'm like, it's almost like when the electrical circuits fry out. I mean,
That's what happened.
What?
That's exactly what happened.
How in God's name, did you ever learn to, did you ever know how to let go and give yourself a break? Or
learn how to take a smaller load.
Yeah.
Because certainly once you have a child,
Yeah.
you got to take a smaller load.
How old were you when you had your daughter?
33.
33. All right. So you had a little bit of time.
Yeah. I dropped out of seminary and just realized hey, this whole minister thing is not for me. And then it just became about here's the thing. In the 9 months I was at seminary, I learned enough for a bachelor's degree. I honestly believe that. And I learned stuff that I still use every day. In fact, right now, as we go through the QAnon and we go through this chaos, we go through the yoga community breaking down, the wellness community breaking down into stupidity and pseudoscience, the denial of science that we see, the feminism we see the rising of, the racial injustice that we still haven't solved. All the things I learned at seminary are helping me cope right now with what's going on.
How do you go from seminary school and figure out what the fuck to do next?
That's a really good question, because I still floundered and I wasn't sure, and I wanted to make sure I was making a decision out of me and not my pain, right? Because seminary was a decision made out of pain that I didn't understand. I wanted to make a decision out of me, and it turned out I still wanted to be smart, still loved academics, and I still loved studying religion. So I ended up in Ireland. Naturally.
God. One of the most religious, oh my God.
Right. So I end up in Ireland, unwed and pregnant.
Oh my God. What? It's like an episode of one of those shows, time traveling shows.
Yeah.
You go, wow. So I knew you went to Ireland, but that happened after breakdown in seminary school?
Yeah.
What the fuck?
Yeah.
Where were you in Ireland? Were you...
Okay, so I was in Dublin, going to Trinity College Dublin, got accepted because it was the only interfaith program at the time besides one in Kentucky. And I knew Ireland more than I knew Kentucky because I had a best friend who was Irish and I had been to the country 6 times. I've been all over Ireland. And so when I saw Trinity had this ecumenics program, and it was steeped in this old tradition of trying to get peace in England and also help Northern Ireland. There was a conflict resolution segment to this whole degree. And I was like, I'm there. I'm going to fucking go to Trinity.
Ecumenics. This is the second reference and maybe the third time I've said ecumenics. Ecumenics means...
Okay, it comes from the Greek word oikonomē, which means one world.
One world. What a great fucking word.
Yeah.
Ecumenics. All right.
And it's basically a term for interfaith dialogue. Originally, it was a term for Protestant Catholic relations. So it's become interfaith. So
your knowledge of religion, what I love is when we sit down and have conversations, usually I come to Carrah with things that I'm either conflicted about, things that I feel some shame about, or I'm wrestling within again, it's that weighting the scales. And when you're talking to me about evening out the scales, it seems like that has been a main theme in your life since this knowledge of your father. So it's interesting that somehow this energy that I've picked up from you, you have become that for me to help me kind of weigh my own personal scales. So
it's always about balance.
It is about balance.
I mean, if there is enlightenment, it's balance.
So I'm so curious because when you arrived into the teaching of yoga, and this is where we met each other, what brought you to it? Why yoga? Was it the philosophy? Was it the health and fitness aspect of it? What brought you into it? Because I do believe that out of all of the religions that you must have studied, Buddhism, Hinduism, these things would be, again, I don't know where your brain was at this time, but there's a lot of things that arise questioning when I first, and I don't have the knowledge that you do. Why decide to teach it?
Well, so the allure of Eastern religion hooks a lot of us because it's different than Western. Western is very concerned with your relationship with Jesus. Mm-hmm. Western is very concerned with your steps that you've taken for your what are the sacraments like? What's the goal of the sacraments really in Catholicism? It's to make sure that you're in that life and you've signified to the public you've done these things, right? It makes you a better Christian. Practicing the faith makes you a better Christian. Whereas Eastern philosophy truly speaks to these psychological mechanisms in our brains, the attachment, I think of the samskaras in Hindu philosophy where they take records of things that have happened in your life. So when you're experiencing something similar, you have the same reaction. They understood this and knew this. I thought this was radical. At the time, also reincarnation made sense to me more than eternal life, kicking it with your homeboy, Jesus, at home, all sorts of things like that. I mean, the allure of meditation, the allure of stillness. Also, I was total in agreement with Buddha that everything is suffering. Mm-hmm. All is suffering. We all suffer. I agree with this. I think also at the time I probably thought the Eightfold Path in Buddhism probably provided a better place to get to that state of enlightenment, which at the time I probably thought was this blissful state where nothing was wrong, I think.
Which is the generic samadhi definition.
There's a goal orientation that Westerners see in Eastern philosophy that maybe Easterners don't see. Uh-huh. But when we look at it from our lens, like the map of yoga, we're like, oh my God, this is leading to something and here's the steps you take. Whereas in our mind, our own Western religions, they're leading to heaven. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of bizarre, but this is actually trying to lead you to a calmer mind, right? This is the illusion of what the Eastern religions are trying to sell because we break it apart and don't take it for what it is. So I was attracted to all of that. Again, the same reason as everybody else. It's different. Eastern religion's not trying to make you feel guilty. It's not trying to put you down. And there's no hell to rot in, right? So you can see why these things are a little bit more attractive, obviously. And once I had learned and wrapped my brain around it and learned that I could practice these things, it made sense. Pema Chodron's book, When Things Fall Apart, I bought it as soon as it came out in 1997, read it now. I think I'm on my fourth time. Uh-huh. Still one of the best books about meditation and learning to stay in the moment. My problem with anxiety was solved by practicing Eastern traditions. The meditation, the stillness. Certainly as I got in more the physical yoga aspect of it, I learned also the dopamine fix, getting the sweat out, doing the vinyasas. And by the time you're done with Shavasana, you're exhausted. Well, at the time, I'm thinking that's yoga. And that made me feel good. Now I realize it's dopamine, But at the time, yoga became this thing for me where my body image just disappeared. I didn't know why. I became much more comfortable with myself in the physical plane, that I had a right to be here and live here. And I was so fortunate in my yoga training to be hooked up with a clinical psychologist.
Which is
huge.
Necessary.
Huge.
Necessary.
He understood the gravity of my problem immediately.
Yes.
I mean, and he didn't know me from Jack.
Yeah.
But when I came to his training and we were required to let go of our fears, we stood in a meadow and he said, "Who's got stuff to let go?" Mm-hmm. And I started shaking. I mean, I started shaking before we even got to the meadow. I didn't know what he was going to say, but I knew something big was going to happen. I start shaking. I'm with my friend Regina. And Regina's got her arm around me, and we're supposed to be in silence. We're in silence. She could tell something was going on with me. I didn't know what was happening. And I start shaking and bawling. We end up in this huge meadow. My yoga teacher starts walking back and forth on the line. And he says, this meadow is your canvas. There's not one stain on this canvas. Behind you is the forest. And you've got to leave something behind in that forest because you can't bring that stain into your canvas. And no one can cross this line until they've left what they need to in the forest. And in the application process for this teacher training, which he called life training, and he wouldn't let you do yoga training until you did life training, and you think it's a scam and he's just getting another $1,000 out of you, right? But really, he's actually a serious psychologist. Like, I'm not taking people on board to be leaders in yoga classes that can't handle it, you know? So, and that's why I trusted him. And finally, I just raised my hand and he said, Carrah, he says, what do you have to let go? And I couldn't stand anymore. I was collapsing. This was 20 years of thinking about my father's story. So I had to put my hands on my knees to hold me as I stood up and looked at him. And I couldn't even lift up my head to yell. I just yelled it to the floor and I said, my name is Carrah Bechtel. I was Carrah Bechtel back then. And I have my father's victim on my shoulders. And my father's victim has been on my shoulders for 20 years. And I have to put him in the forest because I can't walk into that canvas with him anymore because he's got nothing to do with me. And I didn't kill anybody and it's not my crime. And up until that point, my teacher was very upset with the retreat so far because nobody was getting deep. Oh. And I think I just fucking put it all on the line because he looked at me and it was weird because he gave me this look like, oh fuck, she really went there, you know? And everybody on the line was crying, but I didn't pay attention to them because I was just focused on him, like, please hold me, like, don't let me fall onto the floor. And he put his hands right on his heart and he looked at me and he said, aho. And if you know in yoga speak, we've adopted the Native American agreement thing. So everybody says aho. And at that point, somebody stepped forward. And she said, my best friend was killed. She was murdered. And I now know it's time to make peace with that. And she looked at me down the line and she said, thank you. And I was like, oh, fuck. And then other people come forward. Mm-hmm. And this woman said, I've been an anorexic for 7 years. Mm-hmm. And all I wanted to do was die. And she looked at me and she said, thank you. And I was like, what the fuck? Mm-hmm. I was only there to get rid of the victim. And it turned out that me speaking this started bringing everybody forward. And it was really incredible. And a lot of people, once they spoke what they needed to let go of, it was really amazing. And it was held in a functional, clinical, and supportive way, right? Nobody talked about chakras and crystals and what fucking spa they should go to. And then some people like took off into that field. They were happy and I took my time. And I remember looking at that forest because once I let him go, I couldn't. Yeah. And it's hard. I'm sure. Because if I let him go, it means I'm not compassionate. If I let that victim go and never bring him up again, how can I be this enlightened, compassionate, beautiful force in the world if I'm not constantly thinking about the death, right? That if I put it away, then I put away the thing that makes me kind. I know that sounds strange, but for me to keep grieving over this person, I felt I was doing the right thing. I felt I was being kind, that if I were ever to recover from the death, if I were to ever recover from my father's victim, I somehow wouldn't be compassionate. And that might sound strange to everybody out there, but that's how it was in my head. And my yoga teacher was so good at being able to allow me that space and let me see the ridiculousness of it. You know, again, it's got nothing to do with you. But you have to hear that in different ways before it makes sense. And before it makes sense to where you can still hold the space of who you are and be able to say it doesn't matter. So I took my time and I walked into the canvas. And on our last day on the retreat, I ran out back to the meadow again because I couldn't. It was so hard to let him go. I looked at the forest and I just said, I know it's going to be hard for me never to see you again, but I want you to know that I cared about you I cared about everybody that's ever died in a classroom in America. And just because I'm letting you go doesn't mean I'm not thinking about you. And I turned around and looked at the meadow. And a huge flock of deer ran across. And I was like, whoa. I mean, it was as soon as I turned around and said goodbye, they all ran across the meadow. And then I said, I'm done. And I ran back to the campground. And that was really, I mean, it's hard when you can't explain to people that don't understand, you know, that like your father's victim, it just meant something. He meant something to me, you know. And then the day that I did that at dinner time, this girl, Brandy from Detroit, comes and sits next to me. She puts her hand on my thigh. And she said, I don't know if you've heard this before, but my father killed somebody too. And I was like, I mean, I hugged her and I said, I've been waiting forever to hear somebody say that to me. And she said, my circumstances are very different. My dad's still in jail and he's a horrible person, but he's also an artist. And I've learned to paint and draw with my dad in prison when she visits. And she said that that's helped her a lot to forgive him. He was involved in a multiple murder and a house invasion. But to meet somebody with that. So my yoga training was awesome.
Well, and it's interesting now to listen to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I just finished 240 hours that I stopped at 300. Everyone's like, why the hell did you stop your master yoga teacher training? So
Let's
many
talk
reasons.
about bravery and courage.
Thank you for that. But now hearing you speak, it's so interesting how you just have to look at there's so many different processes and there's so many different interpretations of how to become a teacher. And what I find very interesting as I sit across from several teachers, whether it be Dr. Auburn, whether it be Celeste Ellis and Electra Hendrickson, who are yoga teachers, my own mother, is there is a process of learning the information and also the responsibility of the information you're delivering. Mm-hmm. And if it is faith-based or it is something that is supposed to help better someone or bring them to a higher place, there's a responsibility within ourselves to ask ourselves, number one, are we ready? Number two, how are we going to deliver this information? And do it in a way that is digestible, but also doesn't feel... I had one teacher talk about how you're never stealing people's information, like a class, right?
Right.
You get inspired by something, and she would talk about remixing it, like you just put your own spin on it. And I think where when I'm hearing this from you, and I understand now, you know, we both share a lot of similar opinions that we're going to go into another podcast later about, is this feeling of truths that are associated with either a religion or a belief system, and then asking questions about really how is it applicable, and then what are all of the things that we have done with the remixing of it to muddle the information. And then when the information was even created, or this belief system was created, the foundation it was built on is inherently flawed. So
It's a retirement home.
100%. And we will have a whole episode, I think, called The Retirement Home for it. But as you talk to me about this story, how do you not hold on to that and then forgive all the other things, the chakras, the crystals, all of the stuff that goes to get you to that point in training. Because in the beginning, I mean, we're told we're going to go through a lot of changes to become a teacher, and then they dress it up with all these beautiful things. How do you not balance the scales and go, well, I had this really profound moment with it. So like, okay.
So let me tell you the first thing said to us in yoga training. Mm-hmm. I fuck up everything I'm about to teach you, folks. That was the first thing said to us.
Yeah.
We're real from the beginning. I'm full of shit. You're full of shit. This is all shit. It's exactly what he said to us.
Yeah.
So it was a very different training. It wasn't fascinating. It wasn't cool. It was deal with your shit. Uh-huh. If you're going to get up in front of people and talk to people, he's making leaders of us. And I think one of the things you said about all this information, I want to add to that and say, should we even share the information? It's that discernment of like, do you need to walk into a class and start talking about the 8 limbs?
No.
Do you have to do that? So I want to add, like, all the things you talked about, like all the gravitas of all of that. Yeah. Let's add to that and say, also the understanding when to not share.
Yes. And when to actually observe, listen, and bring into a classroom a space for people to actually breathe.
Yeah. So my training was centered around making you a healthier person based on things in psychology and Vedanta philosophy, not necessarily yogic philosophy. Now remember, Vedanta has no divinity. Yoga is a faith-based. Yoga is a religion. It's got a divinity. So there's 2 different angles here. So he was way more Vedantist. And he had a guru in India, and he studied with him. And so his whole thing is know your own shit, know you're full of shit, and it's building the intellect. When you know something, you respond to that knowledge rather than what you want to. And it's that war between what you want and what you know that really my training was focused on. Making you more disciplined, making you better. I mean, he's straight. Like he entered, I think he became a psychologist or therapist because he was an addict. I mean, he was a huge crack addict at the age of 16.
Wow.
Yeah. And gave it all up at 18. And then went into therapy, becoming a therapist, and then India and all those philosophies. So he doesn't even talk, he thinks the chakras are bullshit. Like, he's not going to, I mean, I start talking about the universe. He's like, never bring up the universe to me. Never say the universe to me. He's like, the universe does shit for you. And I was like, oh, okay. Because I was way more new age back then. I mean, we're talking, this is 2013. So I was way more into my Ganesh. Yeah. Lakshmi.
So
Om Gam Ganapate Namaha.
I wish, this is where I laugh. My respect to mispronunciation and language because of the Iranian background. I think I sabotaged myself in my own yoga training where I was like, I will never speak in Sanskrit in my class. Yeah. But then it's so beautiful when you hear it and it's like, God. But as I pause here, because we now have to wrap this episode up, I guess I'm going to have a moment for you to kind of put a bow as neatly as you can from our very first conversation to the story of your father, and now concluding this one, because you will be back, because there's so many things that we are starting to unpack as friends and as people who are in health and wellness that I feel like my audience would love more of. But it's hard to close the book on this particular episode for me, because I feel like there's so much that you want to give. I don't know, just, you know what it is? It's that responsibility of your story and having people listen and not having the words, because my frame of reference is so small.
But that's it. You sat and you listened to a story of horror, of blood, of murder, of a destruction of a family, of a story of America that is still unable to cope with its own violence. This is where we have to be, is right where you are. And people say, how did you get through it? There are no bells and whistles to my story. It is day by day. And I want people to really invest in the day by day. In my talk, which you heard, give up on that resurrection. It's too soon. Just 3 days ain't going to cut it when you got stories of horror to deal with.
Yes.
Can you imagine this whole racial injustice thing with the framework of the resurrection? We're going to get it solved in 3 days.
Yeah.
You know what that would amount to? Changing of a bunch of laws and changing the way people dress. That's it.
100%.
It would not systematically change it. But if you sit in the horror of the story, not knowing what to say, that's how you start the change. Because there's going to be an awful lot of stories coming up to us. Like when I entered seminary and every African-American student said, I'm here for the struggle. I'm like, what the fuck are they talking about, the struggle? What is the struggle? I don't get the struggle. I don't understand. And now I do. That it is ongoing because I've heard the stories of horror. I watched it for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The thing they'd been telling us all the time is that it happens every day. Get your foot off my neck. That's been said since the 1940s. So I say the bow we tie it with is to sit.
Yes.
Sit and listen to stories you don't want to hear. Sit and listen to the reality of what's happening, of feet on necks, bloody hallways, because that is America. I am an American story. I am the most American of stories.
Yes.
So you've got to gather with your other Americans and listen. Because it doesn't matter what color you are. Everybody's got suffering, right? Buddha, all is suffering. But there are going to be levels which with white people are going to have to engage in places that are bloody and they're twisted and they're maniacal because white supremacy is maniacal. Yeah. And you've got to sit in it.
You do. And by putting a bow on it, which sounds horrifying now that it came out of my mouth, is for me, in a way, being able to sit because
leave it untied.
Yes, leave it untied because that's the only way that we're going to move forward. Can't box it back up.
It doesn't go on right now.
No, and it shouldn't because we're just going to have to wake up the next day
and do it all over again, day by day.
So leave it unpacked.
Yeah, and the decoration is your lipstick. So keep that layering it on.
I love it. Well, I loved this. The time flew. Where can people access more of you and especially your talks?
Instagram. My talks right now are kind of spliced on YouTube and there's a bit of them on Facebook. If you are able to search on Facebook Live, like my talk in Toronto or Carrah Quigley talk in Toronto or Carrah Quigley anatomy of a school shooting, that'll come up on YouTube. But if you can watch that particular talk in Toronto on Facebook Live, it's logged in there. Yep. That's the best talk to watch.
Definitely. And what's your Instagram handle?
Instagram is Carrah Q.
Okay.
Yeah, Carrah, because that's how you spell Carrah.
Yes.
And then Q.
I love it. And she's doing more of Instagram
talks.
stories, lives, and she will be speaking more in public. And I will be someone who will always open my platform to you because you have really opened my heart and my mind. And I continue to learn every time I'm with you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed this episode, found it fascinating, please hit the subscribe button on YouTube or Apple, iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio. I'm everywhere. You just need to let me know that you're listening. And please revisit this conversation. There are so many beautiful nuggets of information, of just things that you can think about and just listen to. Again, you may not be agreeing with it, but just take a listen and see what it does, how it changes you. Thanks a lot.